And so we're going to start with Art. I'm just going to come on up.
Good morning. My name is Arther Newhall. I'm Emeritus Research Scholar at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the Ocean Acoustics Lab. And I'm a part of a team that we put together for doing some acoustic monitoring at South Fork Wind. And it's acoustic monitoring and also environmental monitoring, I should say. The team members are from across the country. It's me, Derek, and Nikki Forrest from Woods Hole, Whitey and Billy from University of San Diego, our Scripps, and Gul Pupati and Jim from URI, and Kristen, who's in the audience, and Anwar from HDR. And this is part of the rodeo project sponsored by BOEM. We thank BOEM for funding and for supporting us for doing this work. So what are we doing, really? We're doing underwater acoustic monitoring to measure the vibrations and the propagation associated with pile driving during construction and also during operation later for the offshore wind turbines. We've been doing this for a few years for different projects so that we can compare, but this is not a comparison, this is just for South Fork. And we're collecting necessary data that we think is necessary for our soundscape modeling and understanding the acoustic propagation in the areas and also any that can be used for any sort of potential effects for marine life. And we went to Block Island in 2015, and they have jacket piles, so a little different from monopile installations. And we monitor the construction operation. And we use the same sort of techniques and same instrumentation for all of these. We also went to coastal Virginia, offshore wind, where they had two monopile turbine foundations installed, one with a bubble curtain and one without a bubble curtain, so we could understand what the differences were and if the bubble curtain was really effective. And it was. It's very effective. It's very mature. And I'll show some more results later. And then for South Fork and Vineyard Wind, we have done the preliminary installation monitoring, and we hope to go back out later to do the operational monitoring. And later, there'll be construction, more construction at Vineyard Wind, maybe, but due to the unfortunate turbine failure, we're not sure what's going on, when we'll be able to get back out again. So this is a list of our resources. All the projects were monitored mostly with all these assets that we have. We always use a 2 water column 4 element hydrophone array that extends almost through the whole water column. We put one as close as we can, and one at a far distance so we can get the differences between the propagation effects. And these are always instrumented with environmental sensors, temperature, pressure, salinity, so we get an idea of what the water is doing. We have 4 ocean bottom seismic sensors, which sit on the bottom, which we put in a line separated by 125 meters to measure what the bottom is doing, any motion the bottom is happening at the bottom during installation. We have a 4-element tetrahedral array sled that we use for getting azimuth propagation, know where the sound is coming from, and also for localization for anything that we see on the arrays. And we have a new 4-element 3D vertical hydrophone array with a vector sensor. And that lets us do a full frequency sweep of the sound in 3 dimensions. And I'll talk a little bit more later on about that. And of course, we always do CT cast and all the sensors and all the moorings, everything is well censored. And we have a total hydrophone array that we do it from the ship or from an AUV that we run around to try to get azimuth measurements to understand the propagation at different angles. And it makes a difference. The angles do make a difference. It depends upon bathymetry, it depends upon the bubble curtain, it depends upon just the environment, the changing environment. So it's really important to do a 3D test. And we have developed, and we're continuing to develop, it's different in every single location of a 3D parabolic equation model. And we do that, and to do that, we need to incorporate all of the things that we're measuring. The bottom, the sub-bottom, the environment, the weather, all that goes into the model. And here's, to see what the sensors look like, if you can see this laser on the left-hand side here is the mooring diagram. It's subsurface, has a float on top. It's 10 meters below, so we don't interfere with any ships or anything. And there's 4 hydrophones that span the water column, and it's censored with temperature sensors. We have a geophone, which is attached to the sled here in the center. The tub there is a release mechanism, but there's 4 hydrophone sensors on there to get the direction of the sound. And the OBX is an instrument that sits on the bottom, like I mentioned before, and measures the bottom motion in 2 directions. Or 3 directions, up and down, and sideways and forward. We also we use the AUV, the REMIS 100, with the towed array. The towed array is wrapped up. It's 32 elements. And the REMIS that we're using is the top one. And if you look at the front of it, there's a little source. It's ITC 1007. Which we use sometimes to measure the sound propagating into the bottom to get reflectors, so we understand what's in the sub-bottom. Now, and knowing the sub-bottom is very important when you're doing the modeling. And new that we've been doing is a real-time 3D VHA vertical hydrophone array, which has a surface expression. And it's in real time, but we don't send all the data in real time. We filter modes and send it like EOF, so we have to send the whole data set. And the 3D VHA at the bottom here on the right has 3 hydrophones, and inside is the vector sensor on the same level here. And a vector sensor is basically a hydrophone with motion detectors inside to get the pressure. And so you can get a 3D from that. The vector sensor works best at under a kilohertz. So to get the full spectrum, we use the low frequencies from the vector sensor, and the higher frequencies we get from the 3-element hydrophones. And to validate our model, we put a transmitter under the ship once in a while to take measurements, because we know the exact sound level, we know where we are. We can take a measurement to our assets and to use to validate our model later on. So that's what we're using. As you know, the South Fork Wind Farm here is just east of Block Island. It is cabled to Long Island here. The They've installed 12 turbines. We were going to monitor two A11 here. I don't know if I can see it, and A15, but we missed going out there in time to get A15, so we're doing A10, 11. But we stayed in the water long enough to go ahead and do at least 8 more. So let me go next one. So this is our setup. We had all our line. We went between. We were only allowed to get up to a kilometer from the work zone. So everything is outside the work zone, and we went between A11 and A15 because we thought we'd monitor A15, but we weren't able to. But we did get 8 extras. The ones circled are the ones that we do have data for, or at least receptions on our instruments. We deployed for 21 days, and you can see from the bathymetry in the areas quite a bit. And there's a big difference, and the difference has a lot to do with sound propagation. So it's in this area, and in the center where there is no turbine is Cox's Ledge, which pops up, and I think it's a big rock. But they weren't going to install one on this rock, obviously. But we had a line out to get range dependence from the sounds. So during self work, they employed a double bubble curtain, and it's compressed air. They put a hose in the bottom, and compressed air forced through holes to create a sound barrier at the installation site. They're very small holes. As the bubbles go to the surface, they get larger, so it differs with what it can attenuate. The frequencies will change what it attenuates, and it works very, very well, as you can see from a spectrogram we have here of signals, of strike signals, and the bubble curtain itself doesn't always become circular like it is in the picture here. So that has a lot of effect on the sound, on how it attenuates the sound. And also, it's not consistent. The bubbles it makes is not consistent. And so it's very hard to control, to put down a circular thing through with the currents and everything else. So here's received signals at 3 different locations. One is from the geosled, which is close up to the turbine location. And then we have one at the VLAs in mid-water column. And you'll see that the above 200 hertz, which is the spectrograms, is hertz on the left-hand side, and time is on the x-axis. That is attenuating the sound very well above 200, 250 hertz. And that the background noise is from the ship activity in the area. So it's a pretty loud place, and we're looking into the data we've collected. The reverberation will dominate. We'll get the strike, and then the reverberation will dominate the near signals. But at the far field, you'll see different things. You'll see dispersion, where normal modes, acoustic normal modes separate because they have different, as you go out in distance, they separate because they have different speeds. And also, you notice there's a ground wave. This ground wave is coming through the bottom. And we're not sure if it's going through the water column, well, from the water column into the bottom, under the bubble cloud, or just propagating into the bottom to the receiver we have at 7 kilometers. We have CTDs. It's well mixed up at the top 10 meters. which means the sound has a straight line basically to propagate. And at this time, and it's downward refracting most of the time, so the water is, the sound is propagating into the bottom. It's down propagating because of the sound speed is forcing it down. Just some quick sensor data that we have. Temperature, it does change a lot. It changes up to 5 degrees while we're out there. 5 degrees is 15 meters per second sound speed, so it is relevant. I'm almost out of time, so I'm gonna go a little faster. Here is some data from the OBXs. On the left-hand side is the raw data you'll see during strikes. On the bottom is picking up hydrophone, picking up data. But you also see there's signals for the vertical. The sound, the bottom is moving. There's not a lot, but it is moving vertically on the top, in line when it's forward and back, and also across. So it is moving in many directions. And here's the cumulative sum of a number of strikes that we put together, and you'll see the white line in the middle is a mean, but you'll see the effectiveness of the double bubble curtain. And here is 150 degrees from the OBX on the bottom, close by, and that it attenuates 40 dB. At 80 hertz, it is attenuated at 40, 50 dB, which is very good. It's very effective for the higher frequencies. But the low frequencies, hundreds and below, nothing much is happening. And so my final notes here, the objective was to provide impact-producing activities during construction, to monitor these activities during installation and also operation. To monitor this, we designed a 3D PE model, but to do that, we need the necessary information, which includes bathymetry, the sub-bottom structure, and the water column variability. And the bubble cloud works very, very well for higher frequencies and still should be used for that. But the mitigation methods to reduce the substrate-borne waves and low-frequency water-borne waves should be considered, should be discussed of how that may be done. And finally, we do have signals from marine life, marine mammals on our signals, on our receptions, and we have students working on these projects. Thank you. Feel free to contact me if you want at newhall@hui.edu.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you. And our next presentation by Stendert Laan on scale modeling, testing biodiversity, enhancing scour protections for offshore wind foundations and cables. And I think these are down here. Is this one you? This one?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you want to?
All
right.
See if that works. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stendert Laan, and I work for Deltaris. It's the Dutch Research Institute on Water and the Subsurface. And I will present something on scale model testing of biodiversity scour protection elements. And I do this on behalf of 3 colleagues from the Netherlands. So those are Antonios Emanuil, Natalia Alexandrova, and Luca van Duren, who is also present here at this conference. Let's see if that works. saw a lot of people struggling with this, advancing their slides. I think I'm one of them. Maybe I have to close the other presentation first. Okay. Nope. Maybe if we close this one. That's great. I can also click this maybe, if that works. Yeah. Okay, I'll work with that. Yeah, so we're all set. Yeah, a quick background of this work. Oh, we're not set. Oh. And it's back. Yeah, okay. I will try to click as little as possible. Okay, so as we've discussed extensively during this week, we know that offshore wind farms have an impact on the environment. So they affect stratification and residual currents, and through that affect distribution of fine sediments, primary productions, etc. And because this is known, in tenders for new Dutch offshore wind farms, ecological criteria are a big part. I heard previously it's up to 50% sometimes of the selection criteria. And one of those criteria regards habitat improvement measures for certain species. So to determine these criteria, two pilot studies have been done. So there's one pilot study that was done in the Borsele offshore wind farm and one in Gemini. And this has growing attention in many places, in the North Sea and around the world, also here on the East Coast. And to illustrate the potential of, say, the hard substrate habitat that scour protection can provide, I have a short video here. This video was taken at a conventional offshore wind farm, so no nature inclusiveness has been considered when designing this, but you can see that at the foundation of the monopiles, a lively environment forms. So a lot of different species colonize there, and the biodiversity is enhanced. So it has the potential to add something here. And then before I continue, I wanted to briefly mention scour, because that might not be familiar to everyone. So in essence, if you place a monopile or any other structure in the water column, this of course has an impact on flow. So you have local flow accelerations and wake effects that then influence your local sediment transport, and it can cause local erosion around the structure. And that erosion, that is the scour, that can put your structure stability at risk. As an illustration, see if this works. Yeah, I think it does. I have a short animation from our lab. So we placed a camera in a transparent monopile, and that films in 360 degrees around. And then you see that over time, so the monopile is the black dot in the middle, over time you see scour occurring around that monopile. To prevent this, we place scour protection, so we typically have an armor layer of rocks, and that basically displaces this erosion further away from the monopile, so the structure itself is not at risk, although still erosion occurs at the edge of the scour protection. And at Deltares, we've been involved in a large joint industry project. It's called HESPRO, where we developed guidelines to help design these scour protections. So it's the handbook for scour protection methods. And while doing this project, we also had the opportunity to look at biodiversity enhancing elements in scour protections, and then mainly assessed, say, the design choices that have to be made there. So about that, well, of course, the main point of scour protection is to not put your infrastructure at risk, so that will always be at the top of the list in priorities. But you can, for example, add different structures. So here you see a picture of a reef structure being lowered in an offshore wind farm. And these reef structures, they can provide shelter to certain fish species, etc. It is important that those structures are stable, so they're, say, a safe habitat for species. And of course, you don't want to place them in an area with high sedimentation due to sand waves. You don't want them to be covered for it to be successful. But by making certain choices, you can tailor the design to target certain species. So in the North Sea, the main focus is on cod and oysters. And to target these species, you can think of the specific, you can add openings or crevices in your scour protection or add these structures on top to provide that. And you can also think of certain favorable chemical compositions of the material used. So I have some examples later on of shells being used to provide calcium for oysters to grow on. Now, what we did in this project is that we mainly looked at the stability of those, say, additional elements in the scour protection and whether they pose a risk to the surroundings, so to the underlying scour protection itself and to the monopiles or other infrastructure. And for that, we tested a wide range of concepts. I have some examples in my slides later on, but there is much more in this handbook. But for example, we looked at reef balls and reef pipes. So those are, for example, concrete elements that provide shelter. And we also looked at the addition of loose oyster shells. And to test that, we did physical scale model testing. So in Delft, in the Netherlands, we have a big facility where, so here you see a picture of one of the facilities we have where we can test the effect of waves, currents, and sediment itself on and around these elements. So here I have some examples of how this setup looks. So on the top right, you see a transparent monopile with a camera inside. So that is similar to the video I showed just before. And then around it, you have the scour protection. So in black, we have the filter layer of finer material. Then we have an armor layer with the coarser material for the heavy loads. So that's in blue. And we added these different, in this case, reef balls or other elements, add-ons on top to assess how they behave. But some things cannot be scaled. So for example, oyster shells are almost impossible to scale down to a 1:30 ratio. But luckily, we also have the biggest wave generator in the world. So we were able to use this facility as well to build scour protection in a 1:1 ratio and use, well, real-world oyster shells and not some scaled-down representation. Also some pictures of that. So we looked at the scour protection on cable corridors. So that's what you see in the center bottom pictures. And we also tested full-scale monopiles in that facility. Then in my next slides, I have some videos of these tests. So first, the 1:30 scaled down experiment. Here we see this scour protection with the add-ons on top, with the reef balls. We see side view, and in this circular animation, you see the 360-degree camera filmed from inside of the monopile itself. And what we see here is that we have an amplification zone right around the monopile. So that's where the currents and the forces are the highest, and you see a lot of rocking and sometimes even displacement of these reef balls in this case. And we also have erosion, so seabed deformations at the edge of the scour protection. So sometimes you see one of these add-ons sort of slide off the scour protection onto the seabed. So I think the lesson learned here from this experiment is that when using these additional elements, you would have to think closely on where you want to place them. You would want them to place them somewhere in the middle between this amplification zone and the deformation at the edge of the protection. Then we did a similar experiment with reef pipes. So that's what you see in this animation. And well, as you clearly note, especially in this green reef pipes here in the front, there is a lot of movement. So these elements, they do not have enough friction with the bed. So under high storm conditions, they move a lot, which means that well, first of all, they also do not provide proper shelter for species to stay in there. But they also pose a risk to the infrastructure, because if one of these reef pipes hits the monopile, then it can get damaged. Then an example, like here you see the building of one of these setups in our larger delta flume. So that's this large wave generator. And this is an example of a test we did on the scour protection on a cable corridor. So again with reef balls on top. And And similarly, in that facility, we tested oyster shells. So here you see a reference, scour protection without the shells, and then there are different sections with different types of oyster shells. I know we tested Japanese oysters and flat oysters under irregular wave motion, so orbital motion. And what you see mainly here is that it's very mobile. The shells are simply too light, so they move a lot. In this case, on the cable corridor, that is not a problem for the infrastructure because the cable is buried, so that does not pose a risk to the infrastructure, but it is something to consider. I know alternatively, I don't have pictures of that, but colleagues have also looked at oyster shells in gabions, so they're fixed in place. So a bit of a summary on what the findings are on these reef elements, so really the add-ons. First of all, what's very important to see if there's any rocking and especially larger displacements, so they can pose a risk to the infrastructure. They might hit hanging cables or the coating of the monopile can get damaged. Furthermore, we do notice there is, say, additional erosion of the scour protection itself around those elements because, of course, they also generate flow patterns, and that means that when placing these elements, you might have to use coarser material in your, say, your base scour protection underneath. So that means it would become more expensive. And another big aspect that was, of course, not in the experiments, but there is a very big logistical challenge. You would need additional equipment. How do you get those elements there? You have to lower them onto the seabed in a proper way. And that comes with a lot of complications. So to conclude, these scour protections, they do offer a potential to upscale hard substrate habitats in and around offshore wind farms. There are many different concepts available, but especially for these add-ons, there are technical and logistical challenges, and loose material may be too lightweight, so it's rather unstable especially under storm conditions. And another say concern when using add-ons is that it will likely be necessary to do additional scale model testing to assess their stability. So that also means it's more expensive. So I think the key point, or the take-home message is that probably the most feasible way forward would be to integrate the ecological functions in the scour protection itself. For example, by using different rock gradings to create openings in the scour protection, different rock types to provide certain chemical composition, or what we're testing right now is to use specific concrete elements and that can be used instead of rocks around the monopile. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, and as typical, we'll break for questions at the end, and we'll go to Cormac for our last presentation. And yeah, make it not be me who messes up the presentations here. This one, right? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Yep, so I'm going to be presenting on some work that we've been doing with funding from the Offshore Renewables JIP in the UK, so obviously backed by a number of developers, so thank you to the Carbon Trust for project managing the project and keeping us on track, and obviously to the developers who are part of ORGIP for funding this study. This work is part of a project that's called RADIN, and it has a really broad scope, and I'm going to present on just a small element of it today. which is really focused on how we can potentially design offshore wind pile driving programs to try and minimize level A takes. So here we're talking about marine mammals, and we're talking specifically about PTS onset or level A takes. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors. This is a big team working with ITAP and a number of us at SMRU Consulting where I work. Especially Magda Chudzinska and Maddie Matej were hugely instrumental in the pieces of work that I'll be presenting to you this morning. So really, the question that we wanted to get at was what factors are most important when we're thinking about PTS onset ranges. So PTS onset means basically level A takes. And typically in offshore wind farm impact assessments, the largest impact ranges are typically coming from cumulative sound exposure. Cumulative sound exposure is where every single time the pile is struck, basically the animal's exposure increases and increases and increases, and then once it passes a threshold, that's where you have PTS, an estimate of PTS onset, and that's a take. So it's this cumulative sound exposure. So the temporal element is really, really important here. And so what we were interested in was trying to tease apart which factors are most important. So I've grouped them here into physical, so things like source level, which is obviously a product of your pile diameter, your hammer energy, your site conditions. Obviously, then propagation is also a function of your those factors and also the site conditions. The impulsiveness of the signal was a key thing that we were looking at in this study, and also just the pattern of hammer strikes, which will become clearer in a little bit. Also, there's biological factors. So here, I've included responsive movement of the animal because it's a really important factor. In the UK, where this work was focused on, or Northwest Europe really, in the UK and in Europe, it's accepted that animals will show some form of responsive movement away from the pile as the noise elevates. There are other biological factors like recovery of the auditory system and then consideration of what's the kind of big picture consequences of PTS. But today I'll be focusing on just a couple of these. So really the first question is, do marine mammals move away? And certainly for species like harbour porpoise, which we have a lot of in the North Sea, and species like beach whales with Navy sonar, those are species that are considered to be quite flighty. But what about some of the species that we have in the US, thinking more about low-frequency specialists? Well, looking through the evidence base, we do have some good evidence that animals are redistributing themselves according to the sound field. So on the left is data from harbour seals showing how quite markedly they are redistributing according to pile driving sound field. And then also data on grey whales from in response to seismic exposure, and then also humpback whales on the right-hand side. And basically what these show is, in what is admittedly a limited evidence base, is that we do have reasonable evidence that animals are at the very least shifting densities, and really the only way you can shift those densities is if animals are showing some form of responsive movement. So whilst we have a limited evidence base, and we certainly don't have this for every species, what we do have points to some form of responsive movement. So what we wanted to explore were these cumulative SEL factors, and so we built a relatively simplistic but very fast simulation tool which allowed us to explore lots of different factors. It's built in NetLogo. Basically, the way the tool works is that everything is fixed for a single run. Like I say, it runs very quickly, which allows us to run many, many simulations. We didn't do a complete sensitivity analysis in this study, but we did run hundreds and hundreds of different scenarios. Simulated animals move away from the source at different fixed swim speeds, and then single strike SEL is measured at each animat location, and then we apply the weighting functions calculating the cumulative SELs. And there's lots of variables that we can change in the model, and one of the key ones, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is that the tool is built such that if you actually have the hammer log from a real-world installation, we can just plug that in and run that through the tool. And the run times, like I say, are very short, typically on the order of minutes, but they vary with the duration of the installation and also the number of hammer strikes in the hammer log, because it takes more time to accumulate those sounds. So just to move to results, thinking about which factors are most important. So here I'm going to show you results where we fixed the source level at 220 decibels, so that's pretty close to what's considered the max in many of the UK impact assessments that we've been looking at. The results I'm showing you are for a transmission loss, relatively simplistic, just fixed at 17 log R. But basically these results that I'll show you hold up if we change the source level and we change the transmission loss. So we're looking at the relative patterns here and the change. These results are for a piling simulation where the pile took 6 hours to install and blows were every 2 seconds. So this is a hypothetical example. So what we have here are the PTS onset ranges on the y-axis, the swim speed of the animal under different scenarios. On the left panel is low-frequency cetaceans, so large baleen whales. On the right-hand side, very high-frequency cetaceans, so more akin to harbor porpoises. And then the different colors are actually the thresholds at which the sound moves from being fully impulsive to non-impulsive. And what's interesting on the impulsiveness side is that this is important if it occurs really close to the source. So really, the shift from fully impulsive to non-impulsive needs to happen within a couple of kilometers of the source in order for it to be more important than some of the other factors we've looked at. And what's hopefully obvious is that the swim speed of the animal is really, really important. I didn't include on this figure animals not moving at all, but it would be a couple of stories up if I tried to include it on the slide. So it's a big difference if you don't allow for aversive movement. So one of the things that we realized in this exercise when we were fixing the blow rate at a blow every 2 seconds is that we should really move ahead and see how that compares to the real world. So because this project was funded by ORGIP, it meant we had access to all the developers, and they very kindly provided us with over 200 hammer logs from a number of different wind farms. I think we had 12 different wind farms all around Northwest Europe. We got over 200 hammer logs and compared them all and found that the vast majority were really, really similar. But we chose 44, which I've shown here on the left in various shades of blue that are shaded by their pile diameter. And then we compared those to what is currently being assessed in many impact assessments, at least in the UK. And that's the pink line on the bottom. And that's typically a worst case scenario around about 6 hours. So the first thing you can see is just how much shorter the pile durations are. So time since the first strike is on the x-axis, and you can see most of the installations are being put in 3 hours or less, and that's significantly shorter. But obviously there are a couple of cases where it's a bit larger. The other thing that will become important is that you can actually see in the first 45 minutes of pile driving, there's quite a lot of variability in terms of what happens in those first 45 minutes. And when we start talking about cumulative exposure and what the animal is doing, that makes a big difference. And so this was something we wanted to try and explore, and I'll show you the results of what we did. So this was an exercise to try and look at the design phase, so really what's in the impact assessment, what is permitted, and the real world. What do we get from real world hammer logs? And so these are just simulations where we're only moving the animal at 0.2 meters per second. And anyone who knows anything about marine mammals will understand like that's a fraction of a body length, so we're moving animals extremely slowly. Speed over ground is very, very slow. And the results I'm showing you are for porpoises, but the results also hold up, and it's the same patterns observed for large baleen whales, for example. And what I'm going to show you are percentage reductions in the impacted area as compared to that typical impact assessment scenario that is used in at least UK wind farms. So if you imagine this black circle is a top-down view of your impacted area, so all animals within that region are experiencing at least PTS onset. And then what we wanted to do was, with those 44 different hammer logs that we ran through, compare how different they were. And so the table here on the left shows you the percentage reduction in impact area by using real-world hammer logs. So the smallest reduction in impacted area was a 16% reduction in the impacted area. The median was a 57% reduction in impacted area. So if you're using uniform density of animals, that means you have really significant reductions in the number of takes. And the only parameter that we're varying here is the duration of the hammer log and then the pattern of hammer strikes. So just by fixating on that one parameter, and again, this is with fixed values at 220 decibels, so we're not considering ramp up, we're not considering recovery, we're not considering any other factors. It's simply just allowing the animals to move at 0.2 meters per second away from the source from the start of pile driving, and then it's only the temporal pattern of strike. So this is, whilst we're focusing in on one conservative element, there are a number of other conservative elements that will also drive these ranges to be even smaller, but we didn't assess it here. Thinking about these results in terms of how can we help practically maybe move the industry forward, is we wanted to look and understand, well, what is driving these changes? And basically, it is the total duration of the pile installation that's important, but that's not as important as the number of blows you have in the first 45 minutes. Basically, if you are an engineer and there's some flexibility in your program, putting in longer gaps means lower impact ranges, because as the animals start to move away, they are exposed to lower and lower received levels. And it makes a massive difference. And so that's what this relationship shows here. Basically, the simple take-home is that longer gaps in those first 45 minutes, as much as is practical, can make a big difference. So really, just to summarize, in terms of what we looked at here, the pattern of hammer strikes is something that is extremely important. Real-world hammer logs appear to be approximately halving the impact. That was the median. Like I say, there were also larger, but I think it was something like 75% of all the hammer logs that we looked at had over a 65% reduction in the impacted area. So it's pretty stark and highlights the scale of conservatism. And like I say, thinking about the number of blows in the first 45 minutes may be a way to try and design in some mitigation, especially more and more as we talk about noise abatement as a solution to try and mitigate level A takes. This is an important element to consider in the big picture. And then obviously on the biological side, the critical assumption here is allowing animals to show some form of reversive movement, even if it's very, very slight, and only 0.2 meters per second, even that will make a difference. In the UK, porpoises in impact assessments move at 1.5 meters per second, minke whales move at 3.2 meters per second. So it gives you a sense of the scale here of just using 0.2 is very conservative. So just summarizing some of the highlights and the recommendations, I think it's really important to utilize the evidence base to consider the assumption of no aversive movement. I know in the US the standard practice is not to allow aversive movement, but I think it's important to maybe challenge that assumption a little bit and think how confident are you that animals are not showing aversive movement, because even a small amount of aversive movement makes a massive, massive difference to the impact ranges. So it's really important that we use the evidence base as science evolves, so it's an important thing to talk through. These results are still conservative. Like I say, we didn't allow for any ramp up in sound level. We really only looked at the temporal pattern of strikes. So there's a number of other variables that can be explored which are almost certain to reduce these impact ranges further, and there's a good evidence base to support those. We've discussed with ORGIP and developers about doing a census of real-world hammer logs, a much larger scale, possibly also including the US. Let's get thousands of hammer logs. Let's compare them to the impact assessments to understand how often are the worst case outcomes realized, because we know from working on sound field verification projects that quite often it's not realized, and I think characterizing that and better understanding that would be extremely valuable to help everyone understand kind of to what level of precaution we're dealing with, and kind of how often are the worst case assumptions realized. And we've also, as I said, this potentially scope to think about trying to design your piling profile, and that requires facilitated engagement with engineers, regulatory advisors, acousticians, and marine mammal specialists to see what is feasible. Like, I can come up with great ideas, but I'm not an engineer, and so it's important that these are practical solutions and something can be moved forward. Thank you very much.
All right, can the rest of the presenters come up, and reminder to everybody to please submit questions in the app. And there is a bunch in here, and I'm going to try to get these out. And Art, I'm going to, Arthur, start with you with two questions. One is there coordination with, is there any coordination with the science that your team does at Woods Hole on the sound propagation and the compliance, the folks who are doing the compliance research from industry on that same topic?
Unfortunately, there's not much.
Can you guys hear that?
Okay. We do talk to everyone. We have, most of our information comes out through papers. It's mostly a research project, but we're willing to exchange information, data, or whatever. Just you can contact us. But we don't have any direct line to basically to the regulators.
And so there's no sharing?
There is sharing, but because since we put our data on it's public data. We put them in public repositories. Some of the data is not there just yet, but it's available, and if somebody wants it, they can come contact me.
And I'll go to Stendert. Could you speak to the possible regulatory requirements to use these nature-inclusive designs, and what kind of metrics might be used to assess the success of them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think major caveat is that I'm a numerical modeler of hydrodynamics. I'm really sitting here on behalf of my colleagues. But for what I understood, the regulatory requirements themselves are really on the stability and the risk the elements pose on the surrounding infrastructure. And my best guess would be say that the ecological functions are purely guidelines.
Cormac, have you or your team applied the modeling technique to new technologies such as vibrating and jetting that are currently tested?
No, so not yet. So basically, all of the work we focused in was on impact, pile driving, and like I say, we kept a relatively narrow focus just to try and tease it apart at that level. But I think there's certainly no reason why the same thing could not be applied using different sound sources like vibropiling or other continuous sources. But the key thing will be still if you're allowing aversive movement. If animals are stationary, then you'll have big impact ranges. If animals can move away from the source, then that will be game changing.
Arthur, did South Fork use another attenuation system, ADBM? And if so, did you guys do any testing of that? For South Fork, I'm sorry, I have trouble hearing you too. For South Fork, did they use another attenuation system, ADBM, besides the bubble curtains or in addition that you know of? And if so, did you do any testing when that?
There are other folks out there doing measurements, but I'm not aware of anything else.
Okay. Sorry, these are jumping around. Can acoustic monitoring equipment used in deeper waters for floating? Can acoustic monitoring equipment be used in deeper waters for floating offshore wind, and what type of modifications would be needed? I guess that's for you, Stendert. Or or Arthur. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Once again, are you? Oh, okay.
Can the acoustic monitoring equipment be used in deeper waters for floating offshore wind, or would it need modifications?
I think it definitely applies to floating offshore installations. But there's questions that we'd like to answer with what's existing now, especially with the low frequency propagation. And but you don't need a bubble cloud if it's floating. So, but our instrumentation would definitely be fine for using. Yes.
Cormac, are any of these results decreasing hammer strikes in the first 45 minutes being implemented in newer projects?
So this report was just finished in March, so not yet, but we have had some, thankfully through ORGIP and having a project steering group that involves developers, it means we have got some feedback as to kind of the likelihood, and I think I would say, without being committing anyone to anything, there does seem to be general support that there might be value in getting engineers together to try and figure out, okay, well, what soil conditions, for example, or what site conditions will allow for different kind of installation patterns to be considered. I think, moreover, there's probably greater interest in seeing some of the other things that we understand really well, like ramp up. So, increasing the hammer energy successively, integrating those results in as well to see not just when we're looking at the hammer log pattern, but also what happens when you actually factor in that the received levels are or quieter to start off with, and then, like I say, that will result in even smaller impact ranges, and that will give a better sense of just the scale of conservatism of things that we understand really pretty well in terms of the evidence base supporting.
Back to scour protection. Are there data showing the biodiversity enhancements where they might have been used are actually resulting in fish or invertebrate benefits around those areas?
Yeah, I think that was also shown in one of the first videos I had. So there is indeed an increase in biodiversity in some areas, but for all the details, I'm not probably the one to answer that.
Arthur, is there a frequency at which bubble curtains cease being effective? Are they really only good for minimizing the intensity of the certain frequency sounds?
The bubble curtain's intensity, or the bubble curtain?
Are there data showing this is... I think the question was around, is there a frequency at which bubble curtains cease being effective? Are they only really good for minimizing the intensity of lower frequency sounds?
From what we've observed, they really aren't effective below 150 hertz. And we're not sure where the sound is actually coming from. Is it going underneath it? Is it going through the bubble cloud, a bubble curtain, or is it actually produced in the bottom? The low frequencies that we're seeing are coming from different places. But the bubble curtain itself does attenuate and is very effective at the higher frequencies. And we saw that with work at CVAL when there were installations with the bubble curtain and without a bubble curtain.
So this session's supposed to wrap at 10. I think we can go a little bit longer. I'm going to try to squeeze in a few more questions. On scour protection, has there been any work on seagrass as scour effectiveness? Or I've also seen some artificial seagrass mattresses. Have you guys done any tests on that?
Yeah, I know we do. I think Luca probably has the answer here, but I know we do some testing on vegetation when it comes to wave run-up, but I'm not sure if we did any vegetation on scour protection. Guess the answer is on its way.
We have a phone your friend.
Exactly, the emergency helpline, yeah.
There has been indeed some testing on artificial, seagrass, vegetation-like thing to act as scour protection, but trying to use actual seagrass in this context would be more than stupid because there simply isn't enough light for seagrass. So, I mean, this is offshore. Seagrass really grows in the lower few meters and intertidal. So using seagrass or trying to have seagrass growing around the scour protection here is a no-go area. So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank, if everyone could thank all the speakers. We're going to wrap up the Q&A. There's a few questions that weren't answered, so please just catch them in the hallway, and thank you again.